Another day, another kernel patch stirring up some drama. This time for a little thing known as the TSC, the timestamp counter, being made a boot requirement on Linux. Now this shouldn't be a major surprise, as this has been in discussion for quite a while now, first being authored back in 2025, then being submitted to the kernel a couple of months ago. This patch here is specifically about removing the build code for it. There is a separate patch about actually removing the requirement of the TSC. The reason why this is being talked about now, though, is as of the 7.2 kernel, this change will be in a release. This is a change that is actually going to, I don't want to say affect you, because we'll get to that, but be out there in the wild. Now, as with a lot of kernel changes, and frankly changes in general, there is a lot of bad communication about what is actually happening here. First and foremost, most importantly, this is nothing like TPM 2.0 on Windows 11. When that took place, there were literally new laptops being sold. I'm pretty sure even one of the Microsoft Surfaces being sold at the time that didn't meet that requirement. This was hardware that not even people were just using. People were buying the day that announcement was made. This legitimately affected, actual real people. Whilst there's quite a bit of noise about this, that is not to the extent that things are changing here. Firstly, though, what is the timestamp counter? What is the TSC? Basically, this is a register present on all x86 CPUs. A register is basically a thing on the CPU that stores something and simply counts the number of CPU cycles since reset. Now, you might be asking, why would you want to count CPU cycles? Well, for things like performance profiling. How many CPU cycles does this task take to complete? For things like general low-level system timekeeping. Now, the TSC is not fully reliable in a system that has multiple CPUs because there's multiple TSCs, so which one do you trust? Typically what you do is just say, this is the source of truth, ignore what the other one is doing. Also, early TSC tied the counter to the internal clock speed. That was a problem, because what happens if the speed goes higher, or the speed goes lower, say, for example, for CPU boosting or power saving? Suddenly your clock is running at a different speed. That's not good for a clock where you actually want consistent timekeeping. So modern implementations make use of an invariant TSC that runs just at a steady rate, completely independent of what the CPU speed is actually doing. Long story short, it's a clock, and it's used for things that you use a clock for, keeping time. With that being said, what is the implication of making this mandatory? What kind of systems are no longer going to work? Well, let's say you have a early Ryzen CPU. Is that no longer going to work? No. What about a Intel Haswell chip? That also is still going to work. What if we go all the way back to 1993 with the very first Intel Pentium? That's still going to work. Alright then, what CPUs don't work? Well, let's go back a couple more years to 1989 with the Intel i486. This is a CPU that is no longer going to boot on Linux, along with any of the clones of the CPU made by various companies out there like IBM, Cyrix, Texas Instruments, and a whole bunch of other companies. That was a very common thing that happened back in the 80s, back in the 90s. Now, to be fair, this was an incredibly popular CPU both on the desktop, but also in industry as well. And for that industry usage, Intel themselves, not like a third party, but like Intel themselves, Intel branded i486, they were producing them until 2007. The PlayStation 3 was out by that point. Call of Duty 4 was out by that point. That was a long time after 1989. This was also after the start of the Intel Core platform, so well after most people had an i486. At this point, this was an industry CPU. This was powering some random ARM. This was used in random embedded devices is not something that really existed on the desktop. But 2007 was not the end because clones still existed. I don't believe there are any available now. I think any of the stock that's out there is just old stock, but there were definitely clones that existed well after 2007. With that being the case, now you might say, oh, well, this is a really old CPU, but it was still being used. Sure, fine. But we're not in 2012 anymore. We're not in 2007 anymore. I have extreme doubts that there are any deployments of an i486 in 2026 running a modern kernel. Now, are they going to be running kernels like the 2.6 kernel, the 4.4 kernel, some kernels from well over a decade ago? Absolutely, and they're going to keep running them probably until that machine no longer works and there's no way to repair it because the parts just don't exist any longer. But will that matter with a modern kernel? I have my doubts. I am sure that somebody out there is doing it, and I know there's YouTube videos about it. It's a neat little experiment to do. But like actual usage, not just for a video, not just for like one little thing, I have my doubts. Also, you can just run the 7.1 kernel and be fine. Every single genuine Intel Pentium has a TSC, but there are Pentium-class CPUs from that Pentium era that do not have a TSC. Notably, we have the Cyrix 6X86 from 1985, the IDT WinChip from 1987, the AMD Elen SoC or ELAN, I'm gonna go with Elen, doesn't really matter, from around that same era, along with early AMD K5 chips from 1996. With that being said, later K5s did have a TSC. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but there is a good rule to follow. If it is anything i486, so 1989 or older, no TSC. Anything from around 1993 to about 1997 probably has a TSC, but it can be a bit hit and miss. After that point, the TSC is a completely standard CPU feature, minus, I'm sure, some weird random chip out there, but anything that the like 99.99% of people had, it had a TSC. As a rule of thumb, baseline support for the kernel is pretty much being moved up to the Pentium class of CPUs, and that is, again, the original Pentium CPU, not like modern variants or anything else like that. 1993 Pentium. I want to make another very clear point. This entire time, I've been talking about x86 CPUs. Now, you might know that other platforms like ARM, for example, may not have an x86 style TSC, especially in the embedded space, and that can still be the case today. Modern mainstream chips do, but it's not guaranteed. However, in this specific set of patches, we are only talking about the x86 TSC. We're not talking about ARM, we're not talking about any other sort of architecture, only x86. ARM is a whole nother beast that will come up eventually. We're not dealing with that right now, though. Now, you might be asking, why make the TSC mandatory? And one thing you might be thinking about is the thing that happened a couple of weeks ago with AI going around and poking at everything. That's not per se the reason why this is happening here. I'm sure that's sort of part of it, but it's more of a logistics thing. Every single x86 CPU for the past 30 years has a TSC. But because you have systems that are supported that don't, every single thing that involves the TSC in the kernel, all of that timing-related stuff, has to be written more complicated, has to be tested, has to be designed in a way that is also going to work on those older CPUs, and the kernel already has to deal with the additional complexity of an inconsistent TSC. So dealing with that on top of sometimes just never having a TSC, and then everything that replaces the TSC is just more expensive to use, it just makes things more annoying to deal with for hardware that frankly no one is actually running with a modern kernel. This whole endeavor shouldn't really come as a major surprise to anyone, as this idea of just removing i486 CPUs has been in discussion for quite a while. This is back in April of this year, Linus Torvalds merged the code beginning to remove Intel 486 support in Linux 7.1, and I believe the discussions for this started quite a few years earlier. The same can also be said about the AMD K5 chips, as well as the AMD Ellen SoC. All of this comes about 14 years after dropping support for the i386 CPUs. These were the first 32-bit processors from Intel, and also the CPU that the kernel was first written for. There is something really funny about when this happened. If you look at the comments on Phoronix, they are such a different tone to what you have today. There were people in here basically saying, hey, why not just go and drop 486 as well? Doubt there's anyone using them, doubt there's any working 486 left, and this was a point where there were still clones being made. Like, they still existed. This was like 5 years after Intel themselves stopped producing them. And people were already saying, hey, yeah, just get rid of it. This idea the kernel was just going to support things literally until the end of time, I think is like kind of a more modern concept just because so little stuff has actually been dropped. And I get being sad that this era eventually had to come to an end. If for some reason you desperately need a new kernel on this hardware, which I don't know why you would, and yeah, I get you might have the hardware out there, but new modern kernel from right now, not kernel from 10 years ago, the old kernels are not being deleted, you can always hold back on the 7.1 kernel or just drop back to the latest LTS. Better yet, you probably want to go like considerably older, because even though they are technically supported with newer kernels, my understanding is newer kernels don't exactly play nicely on this old hardware because frankly no one's testing it, no one's writing the kernel for it, so a lot of that stuff has kind of just bit rotted over time. Or if you want something entirely modern, you want a full operating system, there is NetBSD out there as well. You can just do that, but I really doubt that outside of just the fun of running it, anyone out there who actually has a deployment of this is actually being affected. Or your other option is just build the kernel yourself, revert the patch, and be good to go. So let me know your thoughts. Is this something that affects you? Are you watching this video with a 30-plus-year-old CPU? I'd love to know. And if you are, we need to talk. We need to talk. We need to have an intervention. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down below. Like the video, go subscribe as well. Go hype if you're on mobile. And if you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon Scribes Daily Therapy, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and I'm not 30 yet. It's coming close, though.